Hi, this is Simon from Tokyo Productions and welcome to another tutorial for Motion 5. And today we're going to be looking at an effect that I don't really have a name for, but I've called Particular Magic, and it looks something like this. And the idea for this tutorial came from a question that one of you asked, and you wanted to see how one might do an effect that was created using particular inside After Effects. You wanted to know how that could be done in Motion, or indeed if it could be done, and this is my suggestion as to how one might look at that. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a particle or a set of particles that are going to create the tentacles or feelers that make up the outside of this ring or circle. So I've got a new project here, and I'm just going to adjust the width and height to be 480 pixels, so 480 height and width. And we want it to be 24 frames a second and 10 seconds long. So the next thing we're going to do is come to the Bezier tool here, select that. We're going to come to Window, Show HUD, and we don't want to fill, and we want to turn on Outline, and let's make that white, and let's set the width down to 3. And then I'm going to start down here in the bottom left hand corner. I'm going to click, and then I'm going to come up about here, clicking and dragging, come over to here, clicking and dragging, and then I'm just going to click and drag to set my final point over there in the top right hand corner, and then I'm going to hit return. Let's close up the HUD. Let's reset the position of the shape by hitting the transform reset button, and then let's come over to the shape properties here. First of all, I'm going to change the brush type to airbrush, and then I'm going to come over to the stroke tab here, and I'm going to adjust two things. The first is the opacity over stroke, and that's this top control here. So I'm going to set an opacity tab in the center roughly, so that's just clicking on that bar, and I'm going to set another one at the extreme right hand edge. So I've clicked and I've dragged to move it across there. The center one I'm going to position at 50, so that's location 50%. I'm going to set the start opacity down to 5, and the end opacity I think I'll go down to 1, just so we've got a nice fade out at the end, a little bit stronger at the beginning. So then I'll close that up, and the other control I want to look at is width over stroke, and that's this one here. So let's open that up, and what I want to do is I want to hold down the Alt key, and I want to click in the middle to create a keyframe, and I can position that exactly in the middle by typing 50% for the stroke length. And then what I'm going to do is adjust the width over stroke, and I think I'm going to go for something like 250. You can see what that's done is that's fattened up the middle of the stroke, and that's quite nice. So now let's come over to the Geometry tab, and I just want to adjust the start point of the shape, and that's 0.1 here, and I want to set this value for x and y to -200. So -200 for x, -200 for y. And then we want to animate this line, and you've probably guessed that we're going to use the oscillate behavior. So let's come to the library, behaviors, shape, and let's use oscillate shape, add it to our line there, and come to the controls. Just going to reduce the amplitude down to 75, and I'm just going to play it as is so you can see the issue that we're going to have. So that's quite nice, but both the start and end points are oscillating, and what I actually want is I want to lock the start point so it's just in that one position. So in order to do that, I need to change the oscillate around option to line, and that gives me this extra set of controls here. And I'm going to change the start x and y position to that -200 value, so -200 for both of those. And now if we press play, you can see that my start point is nicely locked. Now, one thing I've messed up on is this initial control point is set to linear, so I need to change that. So I'm going to come to View, Show Overlays. I'm going to select Edit Points. Make sure the Bezier line is selected, and I'm going to right click on that first point and select Smooth, and that gives it a Bezier handle, and this is going to be much nicer than that straight line I had before. Okay, let's turn off the overlays, and we're not looking too bad. The one thing we want to avoid is what's happening there, which is the end of the shape coming outside our canvas. So we can obviously just adjust that by coming to the behavior and reducing the amplitude till we just get something that doesn't go too far. And we could also simply just turn on the overlays, select that point and just bring it in a bit, and that might help that situation. There you go. So I'm not going to spend too long on this. You can see the basic principle. What I wanted to point out was that something quite interesting about this X and Y end here. If I set the X and Y end to 0, you can see it makes it all rather dull, and really we're just sort of pivoting about this base, and that's not really what I want. In actual fact, probably the best solution is to set both these values also to -200, and then we get something that looks really quite nice and organic. So what I want is 2 instances of this. Now we've got it all set up, so I'm going to right click, duplicate, and let's turn off the first one, come to the behavior, and I think what I'll do is just change the speed, and I'll go for something like 8.3, just to be randomly different from the first one. And let's turn on the first instance and let's see them both together, and then let's just adjust the phase so that's doing something a little bit different, something like that. And we might also just come in, turn on the overlays, and make some adjustments to these points so that they're significantly different. Maybe those are a little bit too close together. Let's pull that down here. Maybe pull that one down there. Again, this is just something for you to experiment with, get used till you get something that you like the look of. Look at the two of them together so you get a feel for how they're going to work in the final result. Okay, so there's one last thing we need to add before we render these out, and that's a write-on behavior. So let's come to the library, behaviors, come to shape, and let's add the write-on behavior to that first Bezier. So then I want to navigate to 1 second on the timeline, and I want to hit O on the keyboard, and that'll shorten that write-on behavior to last for just 1 second, and this looks like that. Then we'll hold down the Alt key and we'll drag that same write-on behavior to our second instance, and if we turn them both on, we get something that looks like that. Now I want to mute the first one. I want to come to Share, Export Movie. I want to make sure I've selected ProRes 4444. Hit Next. Then I want to navigate to this folder that I've made called Strands, and I will call this Strand 01, and hit Save. Then I'll mute that, and I'll enable the second version. Again, come to Share, Export Movie, still 4444, Next, call this one Strand 2, and render that out. So there we have our basic elements, and we're ready to move on to the main project. Okay, so here we are in a new project. It's 1920-1080 this time. It's 24 frames a second and 10 seconds long. So let's come over to our file browser and navigate to where we rendered those two strand elements, and let's bring them in to the project. So I'm going to select the first strand, and I'm going to come to Object, and I'm going to select Make Particles, or I could hit E on the keyboard. So let me just drag that out into a new group, this newly created emitter, and let's call our base group here Strands, just so we know what's in it, and let's turn it off. And let's look what's happening here with our emitter if I move down the timeline. Select the emitter, come to the inspector. Let's first of all change the shape to circle and the arrangement to outline. And I want to set a radius of 350. And I also want to turn on 3D. I want to come to 1 second on the timeline. And I want to click on the birth rate there, set a keyframe of 30. I'm going to advance 1 frame and reduce that birth rate down to 0. So now the particles will start and they will stop being generated at 1 second. Let's come down here to the life. I want to set that to 12 just to make sure they last the full duration. And I'm going to set the speed down to 0 because what we're using the particle system for here is simply to create an array, and we don't want the particles to actually move off out of the outline. So now we need to think about the angle. So I'm going to turn on align angle, but you'll notice that they all appear to be linked around their center. And in order to fix that, we need to look at our original strands. So let's turn off this group here. Let's turn on our strands group. And I'm going to select strand 1. I'm going to come down to anchor point. And what I want to do is I want to move this anchor point, move it so that it's anchored at that start point. And let's just do the same thing for our other strand, strand 2, turn that on, drag the anchor point down to the start point. Now if we turn that off and turn back on our emitters group, you'll see that things are looking a little bit better. However, what we need to do is we need to adjust this angle, and we need to adjust it quite a long way. 180 should do it. What we can also do is add some randomness to those so it looks a little bit more interesting, and we can just play with that angle and play with the randomness angle till we get something that's looking a bit more interesting and organic. Now I'm just going to turn down the quality a bit just so we get a bit better playback, and I want you to look at what's happening to those individual strands, and you can probably see that there's a bit of odd clicking going on as they appear and disappear. And that's because in the emitter the default is that random start frame is enabled, and we want to turn that off, and that's going to sort out that problem. Now everything's nice and smooth. What we also want to do is we want to come down here and adjust the scale a bit. So let's adjust the scale itself to 75%, and let's increase the scale randomness to 50%. And now that's a bit more rough and ragged and looking a bit nicer. Okay, now what about color? Let's come to color mode and let's select pick from color range. And I want to just come to the menu here and select something called beachfront. Really, I don't want to spend too much time on this, so I'm just selecting a preset there, and that gives us this sort of nice range of colors. Let's also twirl open that color range gradient. I want to make an opacity tab here just after this start, so round about there, clicking on this top bar to do so. And then I want to select the first opacity tab, that's the one on the extreme left, and I want to turn that down to 0, and that means that they will fade on as they're being generated. Okay, so now let's start building some complexity by adding another emitter. So I'm going to select this one, right click, duplicate, and I'm going to take strand 02 and I'm going to add it as the particle cell for this new emitter. Drag it into that source well there. Let's call this strand 02 so that we know we've updated that particle cell. And then let's come to the properties for the emitter, and let's adjust the rotation. So we're filling in some of those holes that we've got there. That's looking quite good. Now let's come back to the emitter itself. Let's turn off the original one, and we need to do something a little bit different with the angle here. I'm just going to turn the randomness down to 0 for the time being, and I want an angle of -70. So let's turn on the other emitter and let's just increase the size of that circle so they're starting to match up a bit better. So that's about 415, something like that. So now we've got those two matching up with each other, so that's looking a bit better. Let's also come down to the bottom of this new emitter and adjust the scale randomness up to 75%. And I might also just play with the spin here, and just don't quite know what's going to happen. Maybe just leave that spin as it is and increase the spin randomness. Let's go up to 5. And what that's going to do is just give us a little bit more sort of irregularity on the inside of that, a little bit more overall movement. So I think that's looking quite good. Okay, so let's make another copy of this. So right click, duplicate, and let's use strand 01 again for this. So drag strand 01 into the particle cell, and let's rename that again so we know what we're doing. So that's strand 01. Again, let's come to the emitter's rotation and just use that to get ourselves lined up a bit better, something like that. Let's turn off the other two while we think about the angle rotation of those. So let's just come around a bit more to about there, and I'll reduce the scale of this one down to about 60, I think, and reduce that scale randomness down to about 30. So let's see how that works with the other two turned on. And that I think is pretty good for now. But just to make this a little bit more interesting, I'm going to offset the timing of these three emitters. So the first one I'm going to leave as is. The second one I'm just going to move it along, I don't know, let's try 8 frames. That's grabbing it on the mini timeline and dragging till I see an 8-frame offset there. Let's select the third one, again grab it on the mini timeline, and let's look for maybe 16-frame offset there. And that'll just make sure that they're all moving just slightly out of phase with each other. I think that's going to be better. Okay, so I just wanted to show you what this looks like in 3D. So I'm going to take this group, right click, make it 3D, and I'm going to come to properties, and I'm going to look for the Y rotation, and then if I rotate it through Y, you can see that actually looks surprisingly 3D. And if this were moving, it would look even more 3D because the movement of those tentacles is really going to deceive the eye. It all goes horribly wrong if we come round the back, and that doesn't look nice at all. But as long as we stay at a roughly 90 degrees on, or look from the front, or 90 degrees to the other side, it's actually going to look pretty nice. So just wanted to show you that. Let's zero out that Y rotation for now. And I want to add some microparticles just emanating from the circle as well, just to give a little bit more visual interest. So I'm going to select that last emitter that I've made, and I'm going to right click, duplicate. And I just want to make sure that one starts at 0, so I'm going to drag it back on the mini timeline to start at 0. Okay, then I'm going to come to the library, and I'm going to look for the content section, and down here in the search bar I'm going to type dust, and I'm going to look for dust 04, and I'm going to bring that into the project, into a new group. Then I'm going to take that final emitter that I've made, I'm going to rename that particle cell dust. I'm going to grab that dust image that I've just brought in, and I'm going to add it to that particle cell. And let's turn off that group that contains the original particle. So first of all, let's clear that search item there. Let's come to the new dust emitter and come to the inspector. And let's just adjust the radius so we're a little bit closer to the average of those, somewhere like that. That's about 350, 360. Then I want to look at the emission latitude, longitude and range. So latitude is going to be 90, longitude is going to be 90, and range is going to be 180. And I'm going to look for the birth rate animation here, and I'm going to come to the point at which I returned that to 0, and I'm going to hit the keyframe button to delete that keyframe. And then I'm going to come to the frame before, which is 1 second, where we set our 30 value, and I'm going to turn that up to 75. Give us a few more particles, and I want to set the life down to 7. Let's increase the spin randomness up to 180, plenty of spin on those. On this opacity bar here, I'm going to click to make a new tab and drag that to the end there and set that opacity down to 0 so that the particles will fade out towards the end of their life. Come down here, I think we can reduce the scale somewhat down to about 30. Let's increase the scale randomness to 50. And then what we need to do is, because they're currently just stuck to that circle like the other particles, is we need to add some speed. So I'm going to set a speed of 100 and speed randomness of 300. So they're shooting off at a different sort of speed. So those are my dust particles. Now let's go to work on the overall look. So first of all, I'm going to select my first emitter. I'm going to come to the library. I'm going to look for filters, scroll down until we get to glow, and I'm going to add a glow to that emitter. And let's come to the inspector. Let's set the radius to 100, the opacity down to 0.5, and the threshold to 0.25. Let's take that glow and, holding down the Alt key, drag it onto the second emitter in order to make a copy. Let's reduce the radius of this one down to 50 and bring the opacity up to 1. And then let's copy that onto the next emitter. Let's set the radius back to 100 and again reduce the opacity down to 0.5. And let's set the threshold to 0 for this one. And finally, let's copy that onto the dust as well. So grab that, holding down the Alt key, and copy it to the dust emitter there. This one will just reduce the radius down to 50, and let's up the opacity to 1. Okay, so that's helped to stylize it quite a bit. Let's grab all of these, close them up for the time being, grab all of these emitters, so that's shift selecting them, come to properties, and set the blend mode to add. And we just need to go through and do something I'd forgotten to do, which is to click the additive blend button for each of the particle emitters. So quickly go through and just click on those additive blend buttons like that. Okay, so this is the main system built, but we need to build a background and add some lighting so it all comes to life. First thing I want to do is to come to the project properties, so that's Command J, and here under the background I want to set that to solid, so that'll be a solid black background. And then I want to come to the library, I want to look for generators, and I want to look for color solid, and I want to drag that in right at the back of everything else, like so. Let's come to the inspector, let's click on the color swatch, and let's darken this right down, and let's reduce the saturation by dragging towards the middle, again darken it down quite a bit. Then what I want to do is come down here and select the circle tool, and I want to hold down the Shift and Alt keys, and I want to drag from the center a circle roughly like that. And because I forgot to turn on the HUD before we did that, we're left with an outline and no fill. So let's turn off the outline, let's turn on the fill, let's again adjust that color down to something like this. Wants to be fairly dark and reasonably desaturated, and let's set the feather to -600. So you can see that's created a sort of central glow, as it were. Then I also want to come to the library here, filters, and I want to look for stylize, and right at the bottom there I'm going to grab vignette and add it to that group, which is going to help me darken down the sides. Let's just bring that in a bit, something like that. That should do fairly nicely. Just helps to focus it in a bit. Next, let's add a camera. So come to Object, New Camera. And I just want to see what it's going to be like when we're looking round the side, like so. So let's go to about -60. Now obviously we're faced with a problem here, which is that our background is running out at this point. But we're going to do something quite interesting with our background group, and that's to select that group. We're going to come to the library, we're going to look for filters, we're going to look for blur, and we're going to look for the ever useful zoom blur, and we're going to add it to that group. And we just need to make sure we move it behind the vignette. And then let's come to the inspector. And I'm going to set a zoom blur value of 32. And now what that's done is it's softened off those edges, and I like the way that this is now seeing off into black at the edge here. Okay, so now let's add some lighting. Now I wanted to point out one thing, which is that as things currently stand, these strands and the dust particles are not going to be illuminated by any lighting that we add, and that's actually fine by me because I want them to be effectively self-illuminating. If you did want them to be illuminated, you'd have to come into the emitter, and here where it says render particles, you'd need to switch that to in global 3D, and then the lights will affect the particles. But we don't need to bother with that in this instance. So let's come to Object and New Light. I want to increase the intensity to 1200, and the fall off I want to increase to 15, and I think the fall off start I want to go for something like 150. Now I also need to come down to my background group here. Let's just call that BG for background. Let's come to its properties. Just want to move this back on Z, so let's go back -50. And this is really all that's being illuminated by these lights is this background. So let's turn off the camera temporarily while we set this up. Let's take that light, and I just want to adjust its position, so I'm going to turn on the overlays, and I'm going to drag it up here to the top left, something like that. I think I've made this light a bit too bright. I've gone a little bit crazy here. Let's reduce that down to about 1000. That's a little bit better. So bright but not crazily bright. And what I also want to do is I want to come to 1 second on the timeline, and I want to hit the keyframe button for the intensity. And then I'll come to the first frame and reduce that down to 0. So this is going to brighten up as the particles draw themselves on. And I also want to duplicate this light, so right click, duplicate, and this one I want to move down to the bottom right here, so come over here and put it somewhere like that, and let's maybe just come to the intensity keyframe there at 1 second and reduce the intensity of this down to about 750, so it's not too overpowering. And let's just turn off the overlays. Maybe that first light is still a little bit bright. Let's go down to 900 possibly. That's more like it, I think. So that's the lighting pretty much done. And here's a render of where we're at so far. I think probably there are too many of those dust particles. I could certainly adjust some of those tentacles and to increase the number. So I might make a few minor adjustments, not waste your time on showing you how I've done it, and we'll come back in 1 second. So finally let's look at setting up our camera move. So let me select the camera. I'm going to come to the first frame, come to the transform here, and let's set up some keyframes. First of all, let's click the global positional keyframe because we want keyframes for all of those. I'm going to set an X rotation of 12 degrees, so we're slightly looking up at the whole thing, and I'm going to set a Y keyframe. So that Y value I'm going to set to -75, and the X position to -50, the Y position to -90, and the Z position to -1100. So I want to make sure to turn the camera back on again. I'm going to come to 3 seconds and 20 frames on the timeline, and I'm going to right click on the Y rotation, and I'm going to show in keyframe editor to bring up the keyframe editor here, and I'm going to click to make a keyframe for the Y rotation, and that value I'm going to set to 7. Next I'll come to 7 seconds and 12 frames on the timeline, and I'm going to set this value to -80. And finally I'll come to the last frame and I'll set that value to -30. And then we just want to take all of these keyframes, draw around them all, and right click, interpolation Bezier, just smooth them all out. Next I want to look at the Z position, so let's right click, showing keyframe editor, and in this case let's come to 5 seconds and let's set the Z value to 575. Let's use the Fit Visible Curves in Window button here. Let's come to the last frame and set a keyframe for -975. Again, let's zoom to fit those. We just need to select that center keyframe, adjust its Bezier handle to smooth that off. Maybe just smooth that outgoing curve as well, and maybe the incoming one. Okay, so now let's look at the X position. So right click, show in keyframe editor. Let's turn off the Z so as not to be confused. We want to come to 6 seconds on the timeline and set that X value to, the X value here to -550. And then finally we want to come to the end and set that X position to -265. Let's grab that center keyframe there and just make a little bit of adjustment to that handle, and again to that one there, and possibly to the initial one as well. Just trying to get those handles to be outside the curve. It's always a better way, then you get a smoother result. Okay, and what have we forgotten? We've forgotten the Y. So let's right click, show in keyframe editor, and it brings up the Y. Let's turn off the X. We want to come to 7 seconds and set that value to -155. And finally come to the end and set it to 165. And again, let's just smooth off those keyframes a bit, like that. That's quite good. This one here can just come like so. Okay, so I think we're done. Let's close up the keyframe editor, have a quick RAM preview. So that looks something like this. So I'm not very happy with the X position round about this 4-second mark, so let's go to that point and then let's open up the X position and let's set a keyframe there, and let's just drag in this window here. We need to come up, in actual fact, like this till we get it a bit more centered. So I think let's just adjust this one here just so we get a nice smooth result between those. And I think that's going to work better. There you go. And possibly at the end here we need to come over a bit more as well. So let's just grab that so we're coming through the middle like that. That's probably a lot better. So there we go. So there you go, that's the final render. I've increased the birth rate on all of the particle elements just so we've got a much more interesting and rich look, and I've just added a little bit more to the lighting, but really this is a kind of project you want to go in and play with and do something of your own. I really just hope to show you the basic principles of what you can do with this technique. So thanks very much indeed for watching, and I hope to see you again on the next one.